America's forests were turning red and dying. Between 2000 and 2020, bark beetles killed more trees across the American West than all the wildfires of the same period combined, and the response from land managers, politicians, and most of the public was immediate, unified, and loud. This was a catastrophe, an enemy, a crisis that demanded intervention. Aerial surveys showed rust-red mountainsides stretching to every horizon, millions of acres of dead lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce standing in silence across Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, and the assumption was nearly universal that the dead wood needed to go. What nobody was paying close enough attention to notice was the insect that moved in after the bark beetle finished its work. A creature roughly the size of a grain of rice, quietly doing something inside those dead trees that would eventually force scientists to admit they had been thinking about forest death completely wrong. The forest that started bleeding. Something quietly shifted in western forests around 1990. The winters had always been the biological check on bark beetle populations. Those cold, hard months that killed overwintering larvae in the outer bark of conifers, and kept beetle numbers at levels the forest had evolved to absorb across millions of years of coexistence. When those winters started getting shorter, the check weakened. When they stopped being reliably cold, it failed entirely. The mountain pine beetle and its close relatives, the spruce beetle, the Douglas fir beetle, the western pine beetle, had always been present in western conifer forests. They had always killed some trees. This had been the rhythm of the system for longer than any recorded history of the land. What happened after 1990 was not a natural rhythm at a louder volume. It was an acceleration that the forest had no evolutionary preparation for, driven by a warming that nothing in their history had produced at anywhere near this speed. By 2010, the mountain pine beetle alone had killed lodgepole pine across more than 40 million acres in the American West and British Columbia combined. Sit with that number for a moment, because it does not become real without effort. 40 million acres is larger than the state of Georgia. It is a landmass of standing dead trees so vast that it visibly changed the color of the Rocky Mountains when viewed from commercial aircraft at cruising altitude, the rust red of freshly killed needles giving way, over 2 or 3 seasons, to the bone white and silver gray of bare trunks stripped of their bark by woodpeckers and weather and time. Colorado lost nearly 3 million acres of lodgepole pine in the decade after 2000. Wyoming recorded comparable losses across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington all documented die-offs that dwarfed anything in their recorded forest histories. The forests were dying faster than the monitoring programs were designed to track, faster than the policy responses could form, faster than the public could absorb what it was seeing. Rangers driving through beetle-affected drainages in the Colorado Rockies in 2008 and 2009 described the experience as moving through a landscape that had been switched off. The silence was the first thing they mentioned in their field notes, every time. No bird song, no wind in needles, because there were no needles left to catch the wind. Just the small, occasional sound of a dead branch dropping in still air. The question that land managers asked, urgently and repeatedly, was, what do we do with all of this dead wood? The answer that most of them arrived at, quickly and with considerable institutional confidence, was, remove it. The reasoning had the satisfying logic of the obvious. Dead trees were fire fuel. Dead trees were hazard trees falling on trails and campgrounds. Dead trees were, self-evidently, dead, and a forest full of dead trees was not, in any framework most land managers were operating within, a forest that was doing well. The chainsaw seemed like the appropriate instrument of rescue, and the timber industry was prepared to provide the chainsaws at no cost to the public, which made the logic even easier to accept. It was the wrong instrument applied to the wrong diagnosis, and the forest would spend the next 15 years generating the data to prove it. The wrong villain. The bark beetle arrived in the public imagination fully cast as the villain. This was understandable and not entirely unfair. The beetles were, in the most measurable sense, killing trees by the tens of millions. They bored through the outer bark of stressed conifers, laid their eggs in the cambium layer just beneath the surface, and their larvae consumed the living tissue that conducted water and nutrients between root and crown. A lodgepole pine fully colonized by mountain pine beetles was, functionally, girdled at every point of colonization simultaneously. It would be dead within a year. The blue stain fungus that the beetles carried with them into the wood accelerated the killing and turned the sapwood a distinctive blue-gray that became, across the years of the epidemic, as recognizable a visual signature as the rust red of the dying needles above. Land managers and politicians reached for salvage logging with a speed that reflected both genuine concern and the availability of a financially convenient solution. Salvage logging is the practice of removing dead and dying trees from affected areas, in theory to recover the timber value before the wood degrades, and to reduce what officials consistently described as a fire hazard of historic and unprecedented proportions. The arguments were made with urgency and with confidence. Timber industry representatives argued the economic case. The value of the dead wood was real, time-sensitive, and would be lost within years to rot and beetle damage that rendered the logs unmarketable. Fire officials argued the safety case. Stands of standing dead conifers represented a fuel load that would produce catastrophic and uncontrollable fire behavior when they eventually burned. Both arguments carried surface logic. Both arguments, as the research that followed would demonstrate, missed something important enough to change the entire conclusion. The foundational error was the framing of the bark beetle as the cause of the problem, rather than as a symptom of a system already deeply stressed. Bark beetles do not kill healthy trees at scale under normal conditions. This is a fact of their biology. They attack stressed trees because a healthy conifer can defend itself by flooding a boring beetle's entry point with resin, physically pitching the insect out of the wound before the egg is laid. A stressed tree cannot produce adequate resin. A drought-stressed forest, in a landscape made unnaturally dense by a century of fire suppression that had eliminated the low-intensity fires that historically thinned the understory, provides enough weakened entry points for a beetle population to build to the numbers that can overwhelm even relatively healthy trees through sheer coordinated mass attack. The beetles were not invading a functioning system. They were responding to a system that had already been compromised by conditions that the salvage logging programs would do nothing to address. Removing the evidence of the beetles' work by cutting the dead trees left the underlying stress conditions entirely intact, and removed something else entirely. Something that nobody in the salvage logging debate had yet thought to put on the table. The insect. Nobody was watching here is the creature worth knowing about. The saproxylic beetle is not a single species. It is a functional category, a guild of insects that depend on dead and dying wood at some stage of their life cycle, and it contains, depending on how the taxonomists are counting on any given decade, somewhere between a third and half of all beetle species in North American forests. That is an extraordinary number. It means that the dead wood in a forest is not a waste product of the living system. It is a habitat in its own right, one that supports a community of organisms as large and complex as the community of the living canopy above it. The wood-boring beetles that follow bark beetle activity are a specific subset of this guild. Species in the families Cerambycidae, the long-horned beetles, and Buprestidae, the jewel beetles, move into trees that have been weakened or recently killed, finding in the dead and dying wood the conditions their larvae need. Wood that is soft enough to bore through, fungal communities that their larvae can feed alongside, the darkness and stability of a decaying trunk. They are not competing with the bark beetle. They are following it, the way a cleaning crew follows a demolition team, entering a space that has been opened up and doing work in it that the opening made possible. The females of these species locate dead and dying trees with a precision that continues to astonish entomologists. Some species detect the volatile compounds released by freshly killed wood from distances of several kilometers. Some detect the heat signature of a recently burned or sun-warmed trunk. The black fire beetle, Melanophila acuminata, famously detects the infrared radiation of active wildfires and will fly into burning stands to lay eggs in freshly killed wood while the fire is still running. This is not metaphorically impressive. It is literally flying into a wildfire because evolution has determined that the wood on the other side of the flames is worth the journey. These insects were present in the beetle-killed forests of the American West throughout the epidemic. They were doing their work in every standing dead tree on every rust-red hillside that the aerial surveys were photographing, and the politicians were describing as devastation. They were almost entirely absent from the scientific and public conversation about what to do with the dead forests. They became visible in the scientific literature around 2015, when a series of studies began asking a question that should have been asked a decade earlier. What actually happens in a dead forest if you leave it alone? What dead trees are actually doing? A standing dead tree is not a dead thing. This is the core correction that saproxylic ecology offers to the intuitive but ecologically wrong framework that most people, and for several decades most professional foresters, applied to deadwood in managed forests. A standing dead tree is a structure, a resource, and an ongoing biological process, simultaneously and for decades, and it remains more biologically active per cubic foot than many components of the living forest around it. The biological activity begins within days of death. If bark beetles cause the death, they have already restructured the cambium layer with their egg galleries, creating a network of channels through the inner bark that will serve as the first access routes for the organisms that follow. The blue stain fungus has colonized the sapwood, softening it chemically and creating conditions that the saproxylic beetles need. The wood-boring beetles arrive and begin excavating their own galleries, deeper into the wood, opening it further to moisture infiltration and microbial colonization. Bacteria follow the moisture into the newly opened wood. The wood begins to soften and change chemically from the outside inward, a process that in a standing dead lodgepole pine in the Rocky Mountain environment will take somewhere between 20 and 80 years to run its full course, depending on species, elevation, aspect, moisture regime, and the specific community of decomposers present and active in that particular tree. At every stage of this decomposition sequence, a distinct community of organisms depends on the wood being at precisely that stage and not some other. Early decay specialists require recently killed wood with intact physical structure, firm enough to support boring, but chemically altered enough by the initial fungal colonization to be accessible. Mid-decay specialists need wood that has been softened by moisture and further colonized by fungi. Wood that has begun to lose its structural integrity but still provides the three-dimensional architecture that their larvae need to develop. Late decay specialists, some of the most ecologically specialized insects in North American forests, require the crumbling, heavily decomposed, heavily fungal material of a trunk in its final decades before it falls and joins the soil. Remove the dead tree at any point in this sequence, and you remove every stage that had not yet occurred, permanently and without replacement for that tree in that location in that stand. What the wood-boring beetles contribute to this sequence is not incidental or secondary. Their galleries physically alter the wood structure in ways that dramatically accelerate moisture infiltration and the fungal colonization that follows. Their frass, the fine sawdust-like material they produce while boring, is rich in partially digested wood tissue and fungal material and deposits at the base of the tree, where it becomes a direct input to the soil community below. When their adults finally emerge through their exit holes after 1 to 3 years of larval development, those holes become permanent access points for the next cohort of decomposers, each generation engineering the habitat that makes the next generation's work possible in a succession as ordered and as consequential as the plant succession happening in the recovering understory around the same tree's base. The woodpecker equation. The black-backed woodpecker does not live in living forests. This sounds like an odd detail, and it is actually one of the most ecologically important facts about the bird. It is an obligate specialist of recently burned and recently beetle-killed forest, a creature so specifically adapted to the habitat of deadwood that its population levels serve as one of the most sensitive indicators of whether a post-disturbance forest is being managed in a way that supports its recovery or dismantled in a way that does not. The black-backed woodpecker feeds primarily on the larvae of wood-boring beetles. It forages by listening for movement inside deadwood, precisely locating larvae with an auditory precision that the woodpecker's laterally asymmetric skull, one ear slightly higher than the other, is specifically adapted to support, and excavating them with a bill designed for sustained impact against hard wood. A single black-backed woodpecker needs a substantial territory of dead and dying trees to sustain itself and raise a brood. A breeding pair needs more. A population of breeding pairs needs what biologists call a complex, a landscape-scale mosaic of dead trees in different stages of decay, distributed across enough area to support the foraging ranges of multiple pairs without competition driving any of them out. In the years following the Great Bark Beetle epidemic, black-backed woodpecker populations in affected areas were tracked by researchers from the American Bird Conservancy and from university wildlife programs across the West. What the data showed was not what the salvage logging advocates had predicted. In areas where beetle-killed trees had been left standing, black-backed woodpecker densities were high, in some measured stands among the highest ever recorded for the species. In areas where salvage logging had removed the dead wood, black-backed woodpecker populations were effectively absent. The birds needed the dead trees more specifically and more urgently than anyone outside the specialist literature had appreciated, and the salvage operations had removed the resource they depended on at the precise moment the resource was most abundant. The woodpecker data mattered beyond the woodpeckers themselves. Black-backed woodpeckers are primary cavity excavators, meaning they create the nest holes that dozens of other species, from small owls to flying squirrels to pine martens, depend on for their own reproduction. A landscape without woodpecker activity is a landscape producing no new cavities, and a landscape without cavities is a landscape from which the cavity-dependent community will gradually disappear. The woodpecker is the keystone species of the deadwood community, in the same way that the wolf is the keystone species of the Elk Willow River system. Its presence or absence determines whether the whole system functions or slowly unravels. The soil. Nobody could see. The most surprising findings from the post-beetle research did not come from the birds or the insects or even the vegetation. They came from underground, from the soil scientists who had set up their sampling plots in beetle-killed stands expecting to document nutrient loss and biological impoverishment, and instead found something that took several rounds of peer review to fully accept. Beetle-killed forests were rebuilding their soil faster than had been predicted. The mechanism ran through the wood-boring insects and through the fungal communities their activity supported. As the saproxylic beetles bored through the dead wood and the fungi colonized the galleries and the wood began to decompose, nutrients that had been locked in the structural tissue of the living tree, bound in lignin and cellulose that most soil organisms cannot directly access, were being released in forms that the soil community could use. The beetles were not just decomposing the wood. They were, in effect, pre-processing it, breaking its physical and chemical structure in ways that made it available to the microbial community in the soil at a rate that would not have been possible without the insect mediation. The mycorrhizal fungi that connect living tree roots in the surviving understory and regenerating seedlings were found, in some sampled stands, to be more active in post-beetle areas than in adjacent undisturbed forest. The working hypothesis, supported by the isotope tracing that soil scientists use to follow nutrients through a system, was that the nutrient pulse released by the decomposing beetle-killed trees was moving through the fungal networks into the root systems of the survivors and the regenerating seedlings, feeding the next generation of the forest with the bodies of the previous one. The dead trees were not dead weight on the recovering system. They were its primary nutrient source. This finding had direct implications for the salvage logging debate that the foresters who had been arguing for dead tree removal found uncomfortable. Removing the dead trees did not just remove the habitat of the woodpeckers and the wood-boring beetles. It removed the nutrient pulse that was feeding the soil, the fungal network, and the seedlings. It interrupted the transfer of biological capital from the old forest to the new one at precisely the moment that transfer was underway. The logged stands recovered more slowly than the unlogged ones, by measures that multiple independent studies confirmed, and the soil data suggested one significant reason why: the fire paradox. The fire hazard argument for salvage logging was the one that resonated most powerfully with the public and with fire management officials, and it was the argument that the subsequent research most directly complicated. The intuition was straightforward. Dead trees are drier than living trees. Dried needles on dead branches are combustible. A hillside of standing dead conifers sounds like a hillside of standing kindling, and a wildfire running through it should be catastrophic. The research did not confirm this picture, at least not in the way the intuition suggested. Studies of fire behavior in beetle-killed forests in Colorado, Wyoming, and British Columbia found that fire behavior in post-beetle stands was more complex and more variable than the catastrophic fuel load narrative had implied. In the first few years after beetle kill, when the dead needles were still on the branches, fire risk in the crowns of the trees was genuinely elevated. But needles fall. Within 3 to 5 years of beetle kill, most stands had lost their needle load, and the standing dead trunks were, ironically, less continuous as a canopy fuel than a living needle-bearing forest would have been. Fire that entered a beetle-killed stand at the 5 to 10 year stage after kill often burned at lower intensity than fire in adjacent living forest, because the latter fuels connecting the ground to the canopy had been reduced by the loss of the needle layer. This was not a universal finding, and it required careful qualification. In some stand structures and under some weather conditions, beetle-killed forests did burn intensely. The fire paradox was not that beetle-killed forests do not burn. It was that the assumption that they always burn worse than living forests, the assumption that drove the urgency of the salvage logging programs, was not supported by the data as consistently as the argument required. The policy had been built on a fire hazard framework that the fire behavior science was not fully endorsing. And the forests that had been logged to reduce the fire hazard were recovering more slowly, with less biological diversity, and with measurably less complex soil communities than the forests that had been left to handle their own dead wood. The management mistake. The comparison studies between salvage-logged and unlogged beetle-affected areas are the most directly policy-relevant research to come out of the post-epidemic science. And they are the research that the timber industry and some segments of the forest management community have pushed back against most forcefully. The findings were not subtle. Unlogged beetle-affected stands showed higher densities of saproxylic insects, higher woodpecker activity, higher rates of cavity creation, higher small mammal diversity, faster soil carbon accumulation, and faster natural regeneration of conifer seedlings than comparable stands where the dead trees had been removed by salvage operations. The regeneration finding was particularly significant. The dead standing trees, as they decayed and eventually fell, were creating nurse log habitat that supported seedling establishment at rates that outpaced the artificial replanting carried out in logged areas in some measured stands. The forest was replanting itself, using the bodies of its dead trees as the medium for its own regeneration, and the salvage operations were removing that medium. The salvage logging debate has not been resolved. The arguments on both sides are still being made in public comment periods for timber sales on national forest land across the West, in legislative hearings, and in the scientific literature. There are genuine complexities. Salvage logging in some situations, particularly around the immediate margins of communities where fire behavior genuinely threatens structures, may be justified on grounds that the ecological cost is outweighed by the safety benefit. The science is not arguing that dead trees should never be removed. It is arguing that the default assumption should be reversed, that dead trees in a forest are doing something important until demonstrated otherwise, not the other way around. That reversal has not yet propagated fully through forest management policy, partly because the science accumulated slowly relative to the speed at which the beetle epidemic created a perceived crisis, and partly because the economic logic of salvage logging, the argument that the timber value of the dead trees should be recovered before it is lost, is an argument that carries weight in political environments where timber revenue matters. The forests that were left alone are doing better. The policy conversation is still catching up. What the forest already knew. Bark beetle outbreaks are not new. This is the fact that the scale of the current epidemic can make it difficult to hold on to, but it is ecologically essential. Beetle outbreaks have occurred in western North American forests repeatedly across the Holocene, the 12,000-year period since the last ice age. Pollen records and tree ring analyses document the signatures of past outbreaks in the forest composition data, showing stands recovering through successional sequences that look remarkably similar to what is being measured in today's post-beetle forests. The forests evolved with these disturbances. The saproxylic insects, the cavity-nesting birds, the fungal networks, the nurse log seedling ecology. All of it is an evolved response to the reliable recurrence of disturbance, not a fragile system struggling to cope with something unprecedented. What is unprecedented, or at least outside the range of variation that the forest's evolutionary history prepared them for, is the speed and geographic synchrony of the current outbreak. Past beetle outbreaks were local and patchy, checked by cold winters and by the uneven distribution of stressed trees across a landscape that contained a mix of ages, species, and density classes. The current outbreak operated at a geographic scale and with a temporal continuity that reflects a climate system moving outside its historical envelope, producing warmer winters across entire mountain ranges simultaneously and drought stress distributed across landscapes that previously experienced it only locally. The forests know how to recover from disturbance. The question that the science is genuinely still working to answer is whether they know how to recover from disturbance that recurs faster than the recovery can complete, in a climate that is continuing to warm and dry, rather than cycling back toward conditions the forests are adapted to. The saproxylic beetles are doing their work. The woodpeckers are doing their work. The fungi are doing their work. The seeds are germinating in the nurse log debris of the fallen dead wood. Whether the regenerating forest will reach maturity before the next stress event, in a climate that is producing stress events more frequently, is a question that the current science cannot yet fully answer and that the forests are in the process of answering for themselves in real time at landscape scale. That is the story of the insect nobody was watching, and what it turned out to be doing in the forest everyone had written off as lost. The bark beetle was not the end of the story. It was, in the most literal ecological sense, the beginning of the next chapter, and the tiny wood-boring insects that followed it in were the authors of a recovery that the scientists who finally looked at the data described, in their careful peer-reviewed language, as faster and more biologically complex than their models had predicted. Leave me a comment. Did you know that dead trees were doing this much work? That is the part that stays with me, and I want to know if it changes how you think about a dead forest. If you are not subscribed yet, we cover stories like this one every single week, and the next one is about a stretch of the Colorado River that was declared dead in 2002 and came back to life through a decision so politically difficult that it took 15 years to make and about 48 hours to visibly work.